In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Almighty God, we ask you to bless us as we prepare to enter the church at the Easter Vigil. We also ask you to teach us, especially by the Holy Gospel, about the value of marriage, the value of the body, that which is called to be holy. And we ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay. So the sixth commandment, everybody's favorite. So the sixth commandment, I've been saying before that we talk about certain things that are holy. So God is holy, God's name is holy, God's day is holy, that's the Sabbath. So family is holy, honor your father and mother. Life is holy, so thou shalt not kill. And now we can talk about the body being holy. Sex itself is holy, so this is something that is also a gift to us. And so there are very positive things to talk about. I think sometimes when people think about the sixth commandment, and so then we think about sex or sexuality, sometimes people think of that sometimes as something that's dirty, but the truth is that we're really talking about something that's beautiful as part of the way that God has created us. So what we'll start with is kind of an overview of the positive theology about the body and about marriage, and about sex. And then we'll go into the things that will be the violation of those principles, and so we'll talk about the things included in the sixth commandment. But first, to say something positive. So the idea, this goes back to creation, and the catechism on this commandment starts really with the reminder of creation from the book of Genesis, that we were made by God, by a loving God who made us to be loving and to love him in return. And we were also made not to be alone, but we were made to be in communion, in relationship with others. So it was not good that the man be alone. God sought a suitable partner for Adam, and then not finding one amongst the other animals of creation, he says, I will prepare a suitable partner, and so God fashions Eve. We say that both Adam and Eve are made in the image of God. So right out of Genesis, it talks about that being the image of God, which is not really to say a physical image, because obviously Adam and Eve physically are different. The image of God that we can say that they share in their human nature is the capacity to know God, the capacity to love and to be loved. So that intellectual capacity that Adam and Eve both share, and the ability then to give of oneself, which is God is love, and so our capacity to love is a reflection of God's great love for us. So we're made in the image and likeness of God, but made male and female. So made the same, but then there's also a critical difference. And that difference is something that is directly willed by God. It was God's direct will that Adam and Eve be created so that you have male and female. We can also say that sexuality is something that affects the entire person. So we're all, in fact, affected by sexuality. They say, I know this is a shocking headline, that men and women are different, okay? I know you didn't know that, okay? Men and women's brains are different. So they think differently, their bodies are different. So really the entire person is affected. So it's not as if you can sort of bracket the idea of being male or female and sort of put that into, well, that's just this little thing that affects only this small part of my life. Well, really it affects the totality of our life. And so this is an important thing. And the identity that we have been given, so the idea of being made male or being made female, the Catechism reminds us that this is part of God's creation, and so we were made to be either male or female, and this is something that is directly willed by God. Now, that's years ago that wouldn't have been a controversial statement at all, but today that's a controversial statement. So some of the things that we see in society is the idea of, well, I'm going to define my own identity, my sexual identity. And that's not what the Catechism says. That's not what the Scripture says. Instead, that identity has been given to us by God. So we have been made, so you are a man or you are a woman, that this is part of how God made you. The idea of them wanting to become the masters of our own identity is then to play creator as opposed to then accepting how God has made us. So when we talk about accepting natural creation, we talk about the created world, and so we want to respect God's creation. We want to honor, the environment around us. Well, we're a part of that as well. So just as we would say that the environment, whether it's animals or plants, or have a certain dignity, and we say, well, we should respect nature. Well, then we also are part of that creation as well, and that also is something that should be respected. And so it's an important thing to accept and to see that as a gift, that is a gift, something that has been given to us by God. Creation itself also has a natural complementarity to it. And so we can say that the man or the woman is incomplete on their own. And so it's really in coming together of the man and the woman that you can see now a creativity that blossoms. So a creativity that would not be present with one person by themselves. But and obviously as husband and wife come together, new life can be created. And so that's the creation or the creativity that can come from the differences between male and female. And so if you have two men or if you have two women, from that does not come forth the creativity or the creation that comes from giving birth or having children, creating new life that can happen when you bring the male and the female together. I know it kind of sounds obvious, but it's an important thing that the Catechism draws out. The natural creativity, the beautiful creativity that was part of the complementarity in God's creation. We ourselves are called to purity. And so one of the things that's mentioned is this is sort of more, it's brought up again in the 9th commandment when we talk about not coveting another person, is to have purity of heart. So blessed are the pure of heart, we hear in the Beatitudes. Blessed are the pure of heart, and because they shall see God. And so there is to be a kind of a purity of intention within us. And so the opposite of that would be to have kind of like adultery in one's heart. And we might remember that Jesus talked about the 6th commandment in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, "Thou shalt not commit adultery, but what I say to you is that we should not even entertain those impure thoughts." And so a person who commits adultery with another person in his heart has already sinned against that person. So to have a kind of purity of intention, and so we don't sort of lower ourselves, but maintain that respect for the other person. The difference there between purity and impurity, I think, has to do with recognizing the dignity of the other person. If we recognize another person and we say there is a person who is created by God and is loved by God, so I know the person, I know who that is. That would be the idea of the purity of seeing the other person as a subject. To look at another person instead as an object, so you could say just as a piece of meat, if one was to put it that way, then that would be a lack of purity. So that's to treat someone merely as an object of desire or an object to be used for pleasure. That's not dignified according to the way we were made. That does not respect the depth of the beauty of our creation. So each of us were made to be a living person who is loved by God, created by God, and who is called to love God in return. And so this then enters into the virtue of chastity. Chastity is, so sometimes you'll hear that, and sometimes it's kind of associated with the idea like chastity means that a person has no sexual activity whatsoever. But that's not strictly speaking that's what we might refer to as celibacy. But that's not what's referred to as chastity. So chastity is, the Catechism describes it, it's the integration of sexuality in the entire human person. So to integrate that portion of our being, to integrate that into our entire life. And not to do so in a way that is disproportionate. So sometimes we see sexual desires get out of control, and so that can become something that diminishes the person. That's not what we would call the integrity of chastity. A person who has that moral integrity or that complete integrity then is not repressing sexuality, but treating it with great reverence and respect. That's actually what chastity would involve. And chastity itself is something that is used according to one's state in life. So we can say that everyone is called to chastity. For the married couple, they practice chastity within their marriage, meaning that they give themselves to each other in the marital act, but only to each other in that exclusive relationship. So, and not to other people outside of the marriage. So that would be the practice of chastity. So with the sense of loving respect between the spouses, so treating each other as with the love and the dignity that they deserve. Then in other states of life, like the priesthood or consecrated life, so we can think about the religious sisters or religious brothers, or those who are called to the priesthood. So then, not being married, chastity for us means then to refrain from using those sexual powers. And so that means a life of celibacy, or to not satisfy those desires. And so that's chastity for the priest, or chastity for the religious. Now all of this all of this is not easy. Okay, this requires a tremendous amount of self-mastery. And the Catechism uses a couple of times where it speaks about the idea that we have to grow in this virtue or this awareness. This is something that is not accomplished overnight, but oftentimes is something that we grow into our appreciation or our understanding of these things as time goes on. When you see couples that have been married for a very long time, they have gone through different trials and different difficulties, and so their love for one another and their respect for one another has deepened, it's matured. And that happens also with our understanding of sexuality, is that we can also deepen in our appreciation and our respect for that. We can use the gifts that God has given us in a selfish way, meaning so I have my sexual powers, I can use them any way I want, that's what the world says. But to use them any way we want is not to respect the way that God made us or what they're intended for. The best form of integrity, personal integrity or chastity, is to respect those gifts and to use them according to God's plan. And that God gives us guideposts along the way, meaning here's how he tells us that we should use these gifts. To use them in another way, not according to God's plan, but according to our will, oftentimes brings about unhappiness and also a lack of freedom. So sometimes you might think of people who practice all sorts of different or who use sexual activity very casually or whatnot, and they might say, oh, well, see, they're free. That's what the world would say. See, they're free. I can do what I want. It's my body. I can do what I want with it. But we would say the gospel, though, then tells us that true freedom is following the path that God leads us. It helps us to actually it happens to be the most free. The reason I say that that's real freedom is because sometimes when people then become a slave of their passions, they say, oh, okay, well, yeah, they can do what they want, and oftentimes do whatever sexual things they wish to do. So they might say that they're free, but oftentimes that can sometimes become very addictive. You might say a person is a victim of their own passions, or a person's life, we become a slave to our passions. If that happens, that really isn't freedom. And so sometimes finding ourselves in that state actually does not really lead to peace. It doesn't lead to true contentment or happiness. Instead, it is a kind of a slavery. It's a sort of slavery to sin. And St. Paul warns us about that. The Catechism warns us about that. So we actually find ourselves to be the most free when we use the gifts that in the best way, meaning the way that God intended us to use them. So anyway, I think there's a kind of a beauty there, because it turns something that the world teaches, turns it upside down on its head. So the world says, here's how you're going to be happy. So do whatever makes you feel good. Here's how you're going to be free. Do whatever makes you feel good. Catechism says it's the reverse. We're the most free when we do what God tells us is the right thing, and we're most happy when we use the gifts that we've been given in accord with God's plan. God's plan is the one that leads us to happiness. The Lord does not want us to be trapped in misery. He wants us to find happiness, and we find happiness ultimately in Him. So there's a kind of asceticism that we have to practice when it comes to the sexual powers that we have. So asceticism is a kind of fancy word that talks about a certain sense of self-denial. So a person then says, well, I choose to not eat certain foods, or I try to limit myself. So a person talks about a diet, for example. I'm limiting what I take in, and this is so that way I can accomplish a goal, whether it's a physical goal, and say, well, so I lose weight, or a spiritual goal. Fasting sometimes can bring about great spiritual things, but a certain amount of self-denial. We have to encounter that in different parts of our lives. We can't eat anything we want with abandon. Well, there's a consequence to that if we do that. We can't just drink whatever we want. So that's sometimes that becomes so drinking can sometimes be something that can bring about great misery. And so there's a limit there. There's harm that we can do in imbibing too much. So also our sexual powers, we could just use them any way we want, but there's a consequence to that. There's pain that can come from that, or negative consequences that can come from that. So instead, we find that we are all called to a certain amount of self-denial. So that's what is called asceticism. This is a kind of temperance, and so you might remember we had at one point we had talked about the cardinal virtue of temperance. And so the temperance is the moderation of our desires or our passions. And so we limit the passions somewhat. So yes, I feel like doing this, but I say no to myself. So I can deny myself certain things for the sake of something that is greater. And we do this all the time. I mean, so we might say that, well, what I'd like to do is sit on the couch and watch TV. But instead, what I find that I should do instead is that, well, no, I should get up and go to work. And every time that a person then gives up a certain pleasure and then embraces something that requires a sacrifice, even if it's just getting up when you don't feel like getting up and getting out the door to get to work, that is ascetic. That's asceticism. A certain amount of self-denial, and we're actually the richer for it. We're better off when we practice a certain kind of asceticism. This is what the Catechism describes as long and exacting work. So to discipline our sexual passions is something that requires really, in many ways we can say it requires a lifetime of effort, and it's something that we're always growing in as we understand and deepen our understanding in the way that we were made and how God calls us to live. The Catechism describes a natural kind of a law of growth, meaning that there is something this is something where we progress in stages. That's how the Catechism describes it, meaning that and we can sort of think of this naturally, that when we talk about children, and then as children get to be a little older, they become adolescents, they become young adults, and then they become adults. Well, any time we're teaching students, whether it's in health class or teaching them about chastity or morality, you don't speak in the same terms to everyone, regardless of their age. We would talk to young children about certain things because this is the stage at which they're at. And so we talk about, for example, the respect for their body, and that we have private parts or things like that. And so you would speak in a certain way to children without necessarily going into other detail. Whereas then when people get older and they become more aware, now we have to recognize the stage of life at which they're in, so that way we can speak to them about the beauty of chastity, about what we're called to do, about the way in which we should live. And so that's an important thing to recognize, is that this is something that is evolving within us. And when we were younger, compared to where we are now, we would say, well, we're at a different stage in our life, and so we can think differently sometimes about these things and can understand maybe the depth of things that we might not have understood, or young people sometimes don't always understand. I do think that the message that is given by our culture oftentimes is, if it feels good, do it. Or another way to put that is, well, if two people love each other, well then who's to stand in the way? Well, why shouldn't two people just love each other? It's kind of a simple message, and I think it's very powerful for young people. The answer that's given in the Catechism or by Scripture is more complicated. And it sometimes is a little difficult for young people to take, especially when we talk about self-denial. So, this says if it feels good, do it. Well, then we talk about take up your cross and deny yourself. Well, that one doesn't sound so good. So it's a deeper message. It's a richer message, but it's also one that is not. The worldly message is a lot quicker, I think, for people to take in. And so I think it's somewhat dangerous, in that I think that's a seductive message for a lot of people in our culture. And so this is where the Catechism talks about the importance for a cultural effort that is needed, meaning that the culture should, ideally, support growth in chastity. Now, our culture does not, I think. I would respectively suggest that our culture probably does not. And maybe most cultures, certainly in the modern world, don't. But you might think back in different times of history at which it was kind of culturally expected that, for example, that people would get married at a certain age. And so the idea of living with one's, with someone who is not one's spouse would have been looked down upon in culture or society. Now today I think that's very different. But back in a time you could say there were cultural values that were kind of embedded to say like, well, no, this is how you should do that. And the culture helps to reinforce those values. Or the expectation, which is less so today, but that once someone gets married, then they will stay married, no matter what. Well, we know that also is not, a cultural value present in our world today, and that divorce oftentimes becomes a refuge that people would turn to. I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a bit, because it's a little bit more complicated. But the idea that the cultural value can either help us or hinder us in practicing chastity. It's a very true statement. And I think our culture oftentimes can become a hindrance. So when we see certain sexual things flaunted out in our society, that is something that can actually make it very difficult for people, for anyone, in particular perhaps for the young. But it can make it difficult to practice chastity when we have so many things that are just sort of thrown at us. And it's very hard to remain distant or removed from that, or to ignore that. This is where sometimes they talk about the idea of custody of the eyes. That's so the idea of like being careful what we take in. So because our eyes, our vision, it's an interesting thing, is that we can sometimes kind of like be drawn toward the things that are appealing to the eye. So we're drawn to things that we find to be enticing or to be beautiful. And so sometimes that can help us seek out noble things. But also there's a certain kind of a sexualization of our society, where a person can sort of be drawn to sort of look or gawk or stare at things that are going to lead toward impurity. The idea of custody of the eyes is that I'm going to be careful about where I look. In other words, we have to all be a little bit cautious about that. So if I know that this is going to be a place where there's going to be a lot of, or I can expect there's going to be a lot of immodesty or immodest dress, then I'm cautious about that. I'm cautious about turning the television on to certain channels or certain programs, because I know that it's likely to be a place where I'm going to see a lot of immodesty. It's going to then cause to dredge up a lot of sexual thoughts or desires, and custody of the eyes might help us to avoid that temptation. Sometimes in the sacrament of confession, and I know we're talking about getting ready for people to make confessions if they haven't done so yet, but in the act of contrition, we hear people say, oh my God, I'm heartily sorry for having offended you. But it finishes by saying, I firmly resolve with the help of your grace to sin no more and to avoid the near occasion of sin. So that near occasion of sin, meaning here's the circumstance. If I put myself in the occasion of sin, I know I'm going to be tempted. So the person who struggles with alcoholism should be cautious about entering a bar. They're entering into the near occasion of perhaps breaking their commitment to sobriety, if that's the case. So also we should be cautious about exposing ourselves to the things that are going to cause thoughts to arise that are immodest. So being cautious about that. I think nowadays too, it probably means being careful about the use of the internet and computers. This is something that when I was first ordained, we wouldn't have talked about that because this wasn't really as an issue, but it is today. So the potential for the eyes to move toward things that would give rise to temptation is a danger. Custody of the eyes means we try to be careful about what we expose ourselves to. Not that we can always do that perfectly, but that certainly can be a help toward chastity. The other thing about chastity is we'd say it's a virtue, meaning we can grow in our sense of integration, meaning that we use our sexual powers the way that we should. We can grow in that, and by practicing that and by making that a habit, we call that a virtue. But it's also a grace, and a grace is a gift from God. So we can ask the Lord for the grace of living out life according to Him. So it's both something that we strive for, so we can do that by our efforts, by self-denial. It's also something that we ask God's help with. So we need God to help us with that too. So we say, Lord, so grant me the grace. St. Augustine prayed for, he struggled with before he became a Christian, and then eventually as a priest and a bishop. But earlier in his life, he talked about struggling with chastity. And he prayed at one point, he said, Lord, grant me chastity, but not yet. He said that's one of the lines. So, okay, I want to grow in this, I just don't know that I'm ready yet. That's okay. But it's, so we can ask for God's help. So it's both something we work toward by our efforts and our discipline, by our self-denial, but we also need God's help as well. Chastity itself, what is the fruit of chastity? So one of the things that comes from a life of chastity is actually deep friendship. That may seem so oftentimes I think in our world today, people would say, well, how do I show charity or love for another person? How do I show that I love another person? Or how do I express that? And they say, well, you sleep with them. That's that's kind of like the automatic answer you might say that the world gives. But chastity, though, that when we talk about Christian friendship, this is actually something much much more significant. So a person can come to know another person's body through sexual intimacy, but to know know a person's soul is an entirely different thing. And so the idea of friendship is it comes from a deep sense of respect for the other person, and sometimes by keeping a kind of a platonic relationship, there is a way in which sometimes we can actually grow in even greater intimacy in knowing that person because we respect a certain kind of boundary there. Especially, now that's not to say that every relationship has to be chaste. Obviously, the relationship between a husband and a wife can be both intimate in the sense of knowing the other person, and also can be strengthened by sexual union. But in particular, when we talk about people, we can also have friendships with people we are not married to, which rightly should not be sexual relationships, but they can be very profound relationships. And we can have great joy in having deep friendships with other people, and respecting them and observing some of those boundaries actually helps protect the friendship. Nobody hates another person like two ex-spouses, right? Boy, does that, you want to see perfect hate, just look at two ex-spouses. That's, so that's one where sometimes I think people sometimes say like sex can ruin a relationship. If you've ever heard anyone say that or observed that, but I think there's a sense in which sometimes when people break down certain barriers that probably shouldn't be broken down, it can actually do harm to a relationship. It's not always necessarily for the best. So there is something to be said about respecting certain boundaries. And for those who are not married, that would be respecting the boundaries of avoiding that sexual intimacy. Let's see, chess. Okay, so we talked about the state in life. Then to talk a little bit about marriage. So when we talk about vocation, so that can be the priesthood. They practice chastity through celibacy, religious life, the vow of chastity. So to live an unmarried life. But then the vocation of marriage practices chastity in a different way through the faithful and exclusive union of the husband and wife, meaning that they're intimate with one another and only with one another. So that's another aspect of chastity. So it's important to talk a little bit about marriage and the good of marriage. So what is marriage? It is the union of a man and a woman, so that the two become one flesh. So literally, in the sexual act, we talk about being physically united in one body. And from that comes the creativity or the procreation that can bring new life into the world. And so it's one of the things that is necessarily bound up within marriage, is within that relationship, is not only the exclusive love, the perpetual and exclusive love of that man for that woman, but also the willingness to accept the gift of life from God, to welcome new life into the world. And so that's something that actually makes the marriage itself fruitful. We talk about that being fruitful, a fruitful marriage, meaning it's open to fruitfulness or the bearing of children. And children themselves are a gift from God. It's one of the things that is a great blessing for married couples. So children are a great blessing. Well, maybe they don't always seem like a great blessing, but in the end, oftentimes you'll be glad in the end. So maybe children can be a little bit of a trial at times. So that can sometimes be difficult for parents as they're raising them. But ideally, that when we talk about people in old age, it's the fact that it's their children and their family that is surrounding them that is part of what provides for their care. It's actually a beautiful thing to see that there's a kind of a reciprocity, that the parents give of themselves to take care of their children when they're young, and then when they're old, it's the children who oftentimes, or should, step up to the plate and then look after and care for the parents. So there is a great gift from God in children. So that's some of the things about, we can say, the theological vision of the body and our sexual powers, and also marriage. So then from that, we can then deduce some of the things that would be the sins against the sixth commandment, or things that would be sins against them. So anything that deviates from that plan of God, or misuses those gifts, then becomes sinful. So we can start to probably guess already what some of those would be. So first of all, we can talk about the idea of what enters into the mind or into the heart. And so the idea of lust would be the sin of focusing on another person, not as a subject, but as an object of desire. And so when we lower ourselves to really think of someone just as an object of desire, an object for our own selfish pleasure, that becomes lust. It's important even in marriage that couples don't lust over one another. The idea of a husband and wife committed to one another means that they're committed in a relationship of love and respect, meaning I love you for who you are. So that is real, that is love, not lust. And so the idea even then of practicing kind of maintaining a certain wholesome attitude, even within marriage, is actually a very noble thing. And maybe that seems unexpected for me to say that, but doesn't mean that husbands and wives shouldn't have passion for one another. They rightly do. But to keep that in the sense of being respectful of the person, I think is important. Misusing the sexual powers that we have, we can do that. A person can do that not with the complementarity of a husband and a wife, but by oneself. So masturbation would be a misuse of that gift. It's something that's meant to be a gift of oneself, meaning I'm giving something to another person. I'm giving and receiving, but when you're talking about a solitary act, there's no giving or receiving. There's no act of love. There, it's just simply to use the body for pleasure. So that would be contrary to the sixth commandment. Fornication would also fall under the same category. So a man and woman who are not married to one another, but who engage in sex, we would call that fornication. And why? Because they are saying with their bodies that I love you completely and totally. I give myself to you in love, but they haven't actually done that because they've not made the commitment in marriage to say I now give myself to you completely and totally. So it's a kind of a lie with the body, you might say. So I'm saying one thing with the body, but not in fact. Then pornography would be another example. That would be when I talked about treating another person simply as an object of pleasure. Pornography would be there as well. It also lacks that sense of decency or modesty that we should strive for. So the idea of not flaunting one's physical attributes. So being modest itself is I think a sign of respect. And so to then reveal that which is hidden to the camera or to the world is really in many ways degrading. And maybe people don't always think about that, but it is. People talk about those who are even actors, and I guess you hear more about this. I mean, people say, well, that's my profession. This is how I pay the bills, how I make money. But that oftentimes is something that leaves a person very empty or degraded. And sometimes you can maybe kind of find stories that are told of people who really lose themselves and actually become who suffer very much because they've been involved in the pornography industry. So it's not certainly a recipe for happiness. It's not self-empowering, nor is it good for people who would view pornography as well. Prostitution would be another obvious example. So there's not really an act of love there at all. That's just simply an exchange for money to satisfy sexual desire. That's not in accord, obviously, with the deeper love that we're called to. Much less would rape. That would be another example. So to forcibly take advantage of another person for sexual purposes, that would also be obviously certainly a crime, but definitely contrary to the gospel. Then the Catechism spends a little time with the question of sodomy, and the question of homosexuality. This is one that demands a little bit of attention here. So one of the things in the Catechism, there are about 3 paragraphs on this, and it's worth reading if you have any questions about that, or sometimes people deal with situations, and it's helpful to have recourse to this passage. But the Catechism takes some time to appreciate that. Some people struggle very much. We can talk about how a person sort of deals with their sexuality or their sexual desire. Some people will struggle with that much more so than others. And so for some people, this can be kind of a trial. And so the idea of feeling a desire or a pull or a yearning for persons of the same sex, it's a reality in that does occur. I mean, so we recognize that some people struggle with that. And but the Catechism does not say that just because it exists doesn't mean that that's a good thing. We were made for the complementarity of the relationship between a man and a woman. And so when a person feels that attraction to the same sex, it's not legitimate to satisfy that desire because it does not use sex within the context of marriage, much less with an openness to bringing new life into the world. And so it's not possible with 2 people of the same sex. But there's a tremendous amount of pastoral sensitivity that the Catechism speaks about. So this is not an easy thing to deal with. I think sometimes people who get into same-sex relationships, and that's, I don't know, and this is not something that would be popular, I think, in Hollywood or, in the public eye today, but I wonder whether or not there's that same sense of longevity or that the same sense of satisfaction that you see sometimes between that heterosexual relationship to the long-standing marital relationship. So I ask that question. I kind of wonder if that's as true. But when we talk about how we were made, so just because a person has a desire for something, well, we all have certain desires. A person might struggle, for example, with the idea of stealing things. They call that person a kleptomaniac. Well, that doesn't mean that the person should satisfy that desire by stealing everything that they can. You'd say that that's a desire, but not one that should be satisfied. So I don't know if that's helpful for you to make that analogy. But there are certain desires, and we can't always act on them or satisfy them. It's not always right for us to do that. So the Catechism speaks about those who struggle with same-sex attraction as being called to chastity or to celibacy, and to be called to offer up as a kind of a sacrifice. There's a certain sacrifice that's involved there, but I think a recognition of what the gifts that the Lord has given us, how they're intended to be used. So I know that's a kind of a difficult thing, but some people, I think, have struggled with this, and I think come to some deep conversion or some deeper understanding about that. But that's what the church. So the church does not condone homosexuality or homosexual marriage, but is kindly disposed toward the people who struggle under these kinds of desires. So anyway, that's my long-winded. I feel like I talked more about that than maybe I needed to. But then also, when we talk about the union within a marriage, it is open to life, and so this also means that contraception would be contrary to the Sixth Commandment. There was an important document that was released in 1968. Paul VI issued a document called Humanae Vitae. There's a long time has passed, so you may not have any memory of this particular issue, but it was controversial in its time. And this is one where the church's teaching on the impermissibility of contraception is a long-standing one, but Paul VI reaffirmed it in 1968. And there was a lot of pushback on that. A lot of people were very upset. And Paul VI was really very far-sighted in that. He wrote a lot of things about some of the dangers of contraception. The idea is that when we give ourselves in love to another person, every act of love comes with a certain amount of sort of vulnerability. I'm taking a certain risk in loving another person. So we always kind of expose our heart to a certain amount of risk. And so the idea is that I can love and play it totally safe doesn't really respect what really is required in love. And so that idea of I want to have the pleasure of sexual intercourse, but not accept the possibility of the idea of bringing new life into the world. So the idea of trying to close the door to the possibility of conception while still engaging in sexual intercourse, that would be inconsistent, as the church describes that. We always have to be open to that possibility of life. Now, with this, though, comes an observation that we have already kind of built within us as sort of a natural way of regulating conception, and that comes from just the physiology of a woman who is fertile for only a certain period of time within a cycle, and then is infertile otherwise. So around the time, and now I'm going to get all clinical on you. So let me get my chart, and I'll show you. Let me point with my to this chart on the wall. But the idea of around ovulation is when a woman is fertile. So one of the things that is mentioned in Humanae Vitae, and it's also mentioned in the Catechism, is the idea that we can make use to the idea of recourse to the idea of infertile times. And there's also a tremendous amount of knowledge we have about this nowadays, that it's possible for people to, as they study their body, as we learn more things, a person can actually chart and figure out when ovulation is occurring, and can know when the best time would be to try to conceive, or the best time to abstain from sexual intercourse if they wish not to conceive. And there is even on our watches. I mean, sometimes I see an app or something that says, chart my cycle or whatever. Now I haven't turned on that app. I'm afraid if I push that button, I don't know what's going to happen. So if I try to use that app, what would happen? I don't know. But but even technologically, we have amazing resources available to us that would not have been available even several decades ago. In the scientific understanding we have of that reproductive cycle, we know so much more now than we knew before. Every form of, I tell this oftentimes to couples who are preparing for marriage, that every form of contraception has both, number one, both a failure rate, and it also has some kind of a downside. There's some downside to that. I can remember when I was young, so I was born in 1971, and I can remember seeing sometimes television shows that would have as a plot point, I forget if it was 8 is enough or one of these, I don't know, where the daughter is going to tell her father, I'm going on the pill. And I just, and the pill was kind of like advertised as like, here's the thing that's going to finally set women free. Now they're going to be completely free with their body and so forth. And that was how it was very much spoken of at the time. Now I was too young to understand, so I'd ask, so what's the pill? And I'm like, okay. Is that like aspirin? Or okay, no. So no, I was, at the time some of that went over my head at the time. But but nowadays, I think people are very cautious. We tend to be much more focused on natural health and organic things and all of that. People are cautious sometimes about what they put in their body. And so the idea of taking a medication or taking a pill, and we're like, well, every pill has side effects. And so I think people are more cautious about that. So the pill wasn't the magic wonder drug that was going to solve all of life's problems. And so too with every other form of contraception, there's always some kind of downside or some kind of failure rate. And so there's a reason why the church then teaches abstinence, or the idea that we can then abstain, even if a couple doesn't want to conceive, to abstain for the fertile period. That's, in many ways, that's much more natural. They call it natural family planning. People love things that are natural, so I don't know, maybe there's something maybe we've kind of come around a little bit in full circle, but that's, so there's a comment on contraception. The idea of trying to conceive in some other way than by means, the natural means. So the idea is that the sexual act and the procreative act are united. So the idea of conceiving by procreation or by sexual union. Sometimes you try to separate that, and so people talk about in vitro fertilization or other things like that. The idea, if science can help cure sterility, so if a person suffers from that, and doctors can help you to regain your natural functions, perfectly fine, and that's a noble thing to do. The idea of circumventing the natural conception by in vitro fertilization is not accepted by the church or by the catechism. Part of it is because we begin to play God or to take on the role of God. Sometimes people don't, I think, fully understand, and I've run into this before with someone who didn't think through what was happening and ended up now with a certain number of fertilized eggs that are kept in storage, and then they're trying to figure out, now what do I do with them? And sometimes the person, well, I'm implanting some of these conceived embryos, but what if I can't make use of all of them? Now, you have children, and you say, well, there's a child, and then mentally we can even kind of think through this. Well, then there's the embryo. Well, that's actually another one of my children. It's just we just hasn't developed. And so what happens? What happens if a person is no longer really able to for that embryo to be implanted, and it becomes a real moral dilemma, moral quandary. So there are consequences to that. That's a complicated thing, and so that's another reason why the church then tells us that you cannot separate the procreative and the procreative act from the sexual act. So to dissociate those two things. Other things that would be a sin against the sixth commandment. So obviously adultery, well, that's right in thou shalt not commit adultery, that's right in the title. So fornication would be unmarried people who have sex with one another. Adultery would be a married person who has sex with someone other than the person to whom they're married. So that would be the difference between adultery and fornication. Obviously it can do great harm to a marriage. Adultery is one of those things that oftentimes causes great disruption to a marriage when it's discovered. Even if it's not discovered, there's this kind of internal conflict the person has because they know I've been unfaithful. So, and that's something that can eat at a person. And so, again, we feel the consequences of our sins. So And with all sin, there's always a price to be paid or a consequence to that. And certainly that's the question there. Divorce, so I need to come around to this. So divorce is technically considered a sin against the permanence of marriage. And here's the problem, is that in some cases, though, you have very complicated situations, especially ones in which there is the potential for harm that can come to persons. The Catechism does talk about the idea of separation of the spouses, and there are times in which spouses may prudently separate and say, okay, we're not in a good place and we actually need time apart. Sometimes what ends up occurring is that sometimes divorce becomes a necessity. It's unfortunate. We don't praise that or say, well, thank God for divorce. But sometimes it becomes an important thing, especially when one of the spouses or when their children happen to be at a certain amount of risk. And that can be because there's physical danger. That can be also because of emotional, it's an emotionally toxic environment. So there can be all sorts of circumstances in which it really is not good for the couple to stay together. We don't encourage divorce. We could say we tolerate divorce. Sometimes it may be the only way that people can be safe in a very, very bad situation. We always want to try, if possible, to save the marriage, and that's where if couples are aware of a problem, it's good to be proactive and try to deal with it while it still can be dealt with. A lot of times I'll have couples that may come to me and they'll want to talk about or maybe kind of get help with their marriage, and oftentimes by the time they come, it's too late because they waited too long. It's the hurts have become too deep, and so there really is not a way to save that marriage. Polygamy, okay, well, that would be against the sixth commandment. So, okay, having multiple wives or multiple husbands, that would be polyandry, I guess, there. Incest would be contrary to the moral law. So when we talk about those with whom we have a natural familial relationship, especially by blood, so incest is not appropriate in those cases. Child abuse obviously would violate the sixth commandment. And then also the Catechism uses the term of free union or a trial marriage. I mean, it's the idea that, well, we're just living together. So we're doing so without the benefit of marriage. We might refer to this also as cohabiting. Here, this is to present oneself as if they're married, or to practice, to live functionally as if they're married, but without actually being married. That would also be contrary to the sixth commandment. A lot of people, before they get married, do seem to move in together. It probably happens more than half the time, at least from my experience or my understanding. But it's interesting that sociologists or people have studied this. Moving in together before couples get married, they actually have a higher divorce rate. I know you wouldn't think that would make sense, but the data on that actually shows that sometimes doesn't actually help. They say, well, we're making sure we're compatible. Okay, well, there's a certain wisdom in, while you're single, live like a single person, and then when you're married, then you can enjoy the fruits of marriage. So this really completes everything about the sixth commandment. I know that's kind of a lot. I'll move on to the ninth commandment and then the 10th commandment. These are much briefer. So the ninth commandment is, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. It fits along with the sixth commandment because we talk about committing adultery. Well, coveting one's neighbor's wife would be the idea of lusting after another person. So short of actually committing another sexual act, it would be the allowing something within the mind or the heart to become preoccupied with that person. We talk about concupiscence. Concupiscence is that desire that is within us that leads us to sin. And so sometimes we're led to the desires of the flesh. And so that would be the idea of lust, and that's something that is not good for us, and so that also can be a sin. We sense that turmoil sometimes, the flesh rebelling against the spirit. So we have a sort of a noble nature that wants us to do what's right, but then we see that sometimes the flesh then drags down the spirit, and sometimes we don't do what we deeply wish to do. And so that would fall under the idea of the ninth commandment. We're called instead to practice a kind of a purification of heart. Blessed are the pure of heart, the Beatitude says. I mentioned that before. And so we're actually richer in our life if we purify our hearts, if our hearts then are pure and noble. Then when they get drugged down by lesser desires, then we are diminished as a result of that. So it can be very corrupting. Instead, it's much more noble to practice a certain purity. That we are called to charity And charity also leads us to chastity, chastity to the love of truth and to right faith. It's an interesting, everything's sort of all connected together. So if we're living a kind of purity of heart, then it actually helps us to see God. That's what the Beatitude says. So our faith can actually be the stronger if we're actually practicing a kind of purity. If our hearts are pure, then we're more free to love and to love deeply, to love God deeply in particular. So it all sort of fits together. Chastity then would be to love with an upright and undivided heart. That would be the most noble thing. So the person then who doesn't practice chastity or doesn't rebel against that covetous desire can then sometimes be shackled by their desires, by lustful desires. Purity is safeguarded by modesty, so modesty is another very important virtue. So protecting the mystery of the person. So when a person doesn't practice modesty, I'm showing everything off for the whole world to see. I want everyone to see. Well, no, there's actually something noble about maintaining a certain sense of mystery. So what is it that actually makes, oftentimes, I think, a person more attractive? It's because the person is enticed by the mystery of who that person is. And modesty protects or preserves that sense of mystery. So when I read that in the Catechism, I said, that's really a beautiful way to say that. That we actually there's a sort of beauty about the fact that there are certain things that are not just revealed to everyone, but things we keep to ourselves, or that we reveal to our spouse and only to our spouse. Only one spouse knows some of those intimate things, and that's part of what makes marriage really very beautiful. We should purify the social climate. So our society can either help us or hurt us. Like I said, oftentimes I think it is hurtful toward purity. But there is actually good news in purity. Purity is actually, living a life of purity is one that actually leads to a richer and a more fulfilling and a happier life. There's a good news to proclaim. Our world doesn't always want to hear that, but it is true that there's great goodness in the idea of purity. We can live a life of pleasure, but oftentimes we find that leaves us empty. On the other hand, when we kind of strive for noble love, then that oftentimes brings peace of heart. So sometimes you think of people who satisfy their lustful desires, but they themselves are filled with a sense of anxiety. It doesn't always lead toward peace. But the peace of knowing that I live a righteous life with God is oftentimes a great reward. And then the 10th commandment, the idea of not coveting my neighbor's goods. So now I'm looking at things, so not people, so we're not talking about lust, but the desire for things or objects. So that's what you might call avarice. So avarice or greed. Greed is another way of saying that. So it's a kind of a lust of the eye. I look at that thing and I say, oh, I want that. So, oh, there's that person who has that car, and that car is nicer than my car, and I want that car. So one of the things that happens when we allow our heart to chase after those worldly goods is it oftentimes can then lead to other sins. And so out of avarice or out of greed then can come jealousy, or then can come an action where, well, now I'm going to go take that. Now I've stolen. And so it just can lead to other sins. We do rightly desire the things that we need in life, but how beautiful it is when we're not so attached to these things that we make our whole life, we evaluate our whole life based on how much we have. That's such an empty way of thinking of oneself. So I'm only as valuable as the things I own. So I want to own the best, and that therein is the danger of greed or jealousy. And so with a certain sense of detachment, it's good for us not to give in to some of that envy. Envy can be a capital sin that can lead us to other sins, but instead we can discipline ourselves and actually be satisfied with what we have. The person who has less but is satisfied is really the richer man. So the person who is content with what they have. And so there is a sense of detachment that we should have. So I don't have to have this or that. In fact, sometimes we can think the things that we end up possessing, sometimes they can become themselves a burden. So if I have all of these things, then I become fearful, because what if I lose them? And so now my heart is troubled because of my things. The rich young man came to Jesus, and Jesus said, sell what you have and give to the poor. And he couldn't do it. He wasn't free to follow Jesus because he had many possessions. He couldn't let go. So he said, well, he's the rich man. Look at all he's got. Well, yeah, but what he has is a burden. The things that he owns ends up actually owning him instead. St. Paul says instead what we should do is crucify the flesh with its desires. so as to live by the Spirit. So sometimes we desire certain things, and so sometimes we make sacrifices and deliberately give up certain things so as to live more for the Spirit. You can either live in the world or you can live in the world that is to come. You cannot serve God and mammon, Jesus said. So you can say, well, I'm serving God, but I'm also making sure I keep my hand. I've got one hand to the Lord in prayer. I've got another hand that's grasping at the things of the world. And it's a tug of war. It's like we can't do that completely without being torn apart at some point. So we're either going to go with the world or we're going to go with the Lord. So it is good for us to practice a certain kind of poverty of heart, a spiritual poverty, you might say, to see that riches can sometimes be a trap for us. Instead, we should prize God above all things. So which is more valuable, our faith or having that other car? A relationship with the Lord or having that nice house, in one area. So a little detachment there helps us to maintain perspective, and I think that's very helpful. So, and that leads to that richer life. So as with all these things, the 6th commandment, the 9th commandment, the 10th commandment, the Lord wants to save us from suffering, from distress. And so oftentimes we can find the distress that comes from satisfying some of those desires, how much happier we are if we have the Lord. So, and the Lord first and foremost above all things. So anyway, so there's the last of the commandments, 6, 9, and 10. So we'll say, glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end.